The auditorium of the Galactic Academy of Linguistics loomed like a cathedral carved from obsidian and starlight. Spanning 3 floors in height and filled with a dull, humming tension, it felt less like an examination hall and more like the site of an impending trial. Dozens of circular translation pods hovered slightly above the silver floor, each one assigned to a single student. The glow from the walls was ambient, soft, and cold, designed to eliminate distractions. Screens floated in mid-air, ready to display instructions in every known language. The silence among the students wasn't one of serenity, it was coiled pressure. Everyone knew what was coming. This was the syntax purity exam, a trial so feared and revered that even the most elite students whispered its name only in private. June stood near the back, adjusting the collar of her academy uniform. It was stiff and too tight around the neck. She had arrived early. Humans were always early in places like this. In front of her, a Vortari student oozed across his station in nervous coils, occasionally twitching one of his 6 limbs to realign his translator cuffs, even though they were already powered down for the test. On her left, a pair of winged Yellerin murmured to one another with their neck fans flaring and deflating like concertinas, signaling subtle tonal shifts that only someone from their species could interpret. No one spoke to her. No one had spoken to her since orientation week, unless prompted by faculty. June was used to this. In her first year, the novelty of a human student in the Advanced Linguistics Division brought some curiosity. A few asked her questions, mostly condescending ones. How did humans manage with only one mouth? How could she understand mood without ultraviolet facial markings? Did she even dream in grammatical trees? But that curiosity had quickly evaporated, replaced by the quiet exclusion that came when other students realized she wasn't here to entertain or explain herself. She was here to win. Above the crowd, the ceiling parted with a low mechanical shutter, and a ring of holographic light spiraled down. The exam initiator descended from the upper dome, a gleaming orb surrounded by a rotating language wheel. It pulsed with symbols from hundreds of scripts, curls, angles, glowing veins of living glyphs. When it spoke, its voice came not through sound but directly into the cognitive centers of each student, bypassing speech entirely. Syntax purity examination begins now. Instructions as follows. The language wheel slowed, then reshuffled as the exam interface began to load. All memory implants deactivated. Neural link dictionaries purged. All external translation devices disabled. A sudden wave of unease passed through the crowd. For many of these alien cadets, translation had always been enhanced by species-specific technologies, aura harmonizers, echolocation, grammar modulators, semantic residue absorbers, but not today. Today, only raw skill would decide success. Each student received a hovering sphere containing the Galactic Peace Accord, an ancient document encoded in 5 distinct alien languages, each with its own brutal grammatical complexity. June's orb spun to life, revealing the first passage in Drenvac script, a language that used kinetic sentence construction, where the meaning of a word changed depending on how many times a symbol rotated while being read. She stared at it, then let her eyes drift to the second section, written in Krishun, a tonal sequence meant to be sung in minor 7th intervals. The third was worse. Zothrel, a language spoken only in dreams and notoriously resistant to written transcription. The fourth belonged to the Kalkari, whose sentences could not be read in a linear direction, but instead in emotional waves sensed through pattern. The final section was an ancient galactic neutral, the only language with rules stable enough to anchor the others. The task was simple in its cruelty: translate the accord flawlessly into all 5 languages, preserving original intent, honorifics, and syntactic logic without altering a single semantic register. It wasn't enough to be accurate. Every translated version had to be as perfect and grammatically pure as the original. June took a breath. This wasn't new to her. She had studied these languages for years, not because she liked them, but because she had no choice. Unlike other students who grew up speaking in trivocal resonance or with scent-laced inflections, June had spent her childhood in a cramped lunar outpost, listening to her linguist mother teach her how to mimic alien grammatical flows, using nothing but paper and her own mind. There had been no advanced implants or real-time parsing, just grit and repetition. To her right, a luxuriant cadet chuckled through his gill slits, murmuring to his companion, "The human won't last 30 minutes." Her brain can't handle recursive predicate logic. June didn't respond. She didn't even glance at him. She closed her eyes and listened instead to her own heartbeat. She imagined it ticking like punctuation. Then the signal came, a soft chime that told every student the exam had officially started. June opened her eyes and focused on the Durenvach passage again. She visualized the kinetic rotations, let her mind drift into that strange space where motion and meaning blended. She began writing slowly, using a stylus that hovered across the projection surface. The script twisted under her hand, fighting against her earthborn logic, but she moved with it. Each symbol felt like swimming upstream in a river of rules that didn't belong to her, but she kept swimming. Around the room, others worked faster. A towering Obelaxian student layered multiple translation fields in the air using his crystal fiber fingers, producing bursts of light with every clause he completed. A Lithari scrawled ancient runes into the air with her tail, each one exploding into smaller syntactic branches that hovered like fireflies. June kept her pace slow and steady. She reached the Krashun section and hesitated. This language was built on tone and breath. Most students used sonic mapping implants to detect resonance patterns. June had no such advantage, but she remembered the lullabies her mother used to mim tones that mimicked Krashun cadence. She began transcribing phonetically, assigning harmonic placeholders to each clause and noting pitch curvature by hand. Halfway through, her head ached, her neck cramped. The symbols she had written began to blur, but she pushed forward. She could feel the structure fracturing beneath the weight of incompatibility. These languages were never meant to exist in the same space. Each one carried cultural priorities so distinct they actively rejected the logic of the next. Yet the exam demanded unity. She looked around again. Some students had stopped. A few simply stared at their spheres, unable to proceed. Others clutched their heads, overwhelmed by the growing complexity. The luxurian next to her cursed loudly and slammed his palm onto the desk, his stylus snapping in half. But June didn't stop. She kept translating. She kept shaping meaning. She didn't know it yet, but she was already preparing to change the rules. Not by choice, but by necessity. Something deep in her, something innately human, refused to accept that this was a dead end. Somewhere between the structure of Krashun and the emotional logic of Kelkeri, she began to see not dissonance, but opportunity. The moment had not arrived yet, but the seeds of her revolution had already been planted. The air inside June's pod grew thinner as time passed, or so it felt. Maybe it was only her breath catching in her throat, caught between the collision of tenses and tonal logic that refused to coexist. She stared at the segment in Zothrel, the third language in the sequence, and the lines blurred in and out of form like memories trying to rewrite themselves. Zothrel, the dream language, didn't follow the sequence of time. Its verbs flowed based on subconscious logic, something spoken in sleep, heard in silence, and rewritten in meaning, depending on how deep the speaker had emotionally processed the sentence. It was a language designed not for waking minds, but for the logic of feelings that only made sense once forgotten. She tried to approach it methodically. Her training told her to find an anchor, something to hold the phrase in place and map it back to an Earth-like syntactic core. But Zothrel refused to yield. The subject in one clause bled into the object in the next, and pronouns dissolved into emotional impressions, not people. One word meant hope when read slowly, but abandonment if read with anxious anticipation. There were no nouns, no prepositions, only impressions shaped by dream logic. June scribbled notes furiously, trying to apply a matrix she had once devised in a practice session, but it fractured immediately. Her logic grid couldn't handle temporal loops within a sentence. She tried again, dissecting the first phrase and writing what she thought was a reasonable equivalent in galactic neutral. But when she ran it through the reverse logic, the result was nonsense. A sadness gently screamed future rain. That wasn't translation. That was emotional collapse masquerading as grammar. She sighed and rubbed her eyes. Around her, a few students had already given up. One of the Yelloran had folded her wings tight against her body and was rocking slowly in her pod. A Kelkari across the chamber was motionless, frozen mid-script, her projection flickering with warning lights that pulsed a dim red. The exam orb above pulsed cold blue. No outside help, no withdrawal, no excuses. June stared again at the Zothrel phrase, then slowly began to erase everything she had written. She let her pen hover in mid-air for a moment, then closed her eyes and did something no human instructor had ever advised. She let herself drift. Not sleep, not meditation, something in between. She allowed the sentence to rise in her memory like a dream half recalled. As she entered this state, her breathing slowed. She began to feel the meaning of the sentence, not its words, but the mood it conveyed. It wasn't meant to be translated line by line. It had to be felt, and then expressed in a way that preserved its emotional resonance. With a steadier hand, she rewrote the phrase. This time it wasn't literal, but it was honest. The resulting line in galactic neutral said, "The path that could have been now walks alone." That wasn't what the original said exactly, but June could feel it in her chest. It was right. It fit. And it was the only way Zothrel could be understood by something awake. As soon as she moved to the Kelkari segment, new problems surfaced. This language didn't care for words in a structured line. Kelkari syntax was spatial. Sentences were laid out in patterns, like shapes in sand. Meaning wasn't in the sequence but in the relationship between clusters. Moreover, every sentence had to match the speaker's emotional intention, and emotional deviation made the sentence grammatically false. There were no lies in Kelkari. If the speaker's heart wavered, the sentence collapsed. June stared at the phrase, trying to force its pattern into something linear. It was impossible. Each cluster had a relational weight. Some lines spiraled inwards, suggesting secrecy or introspection. Others bloomed outward in shapes that suggested generosity or threat. She had studied Kelkari diagramming for weeks. It was one of the few linguistic systems that refused to be taught with words. It had to be drawn, traced, and emotionally rehearsed like choreography. She leaned forward, opening a new tab in her projection interface, and began mapping the clusters by proximity. Each glyph pulsed with faint color, indicating the emotional valence. One segment was violet, anxiety. The next one was a warm amber, cautious hope. Another burned red, determination or desperation. She drew lines between the clusters, then added a faint spiral in the center, following a technique used in pre-treaty Kelkari literature. The meaning unfolded in her mind like a painting. In fear, she offered peace. Not because she trusted, but because she dared. She exhaled deeply. That was closer, not perfect, but within the structure of Kelkari logic it was grammatically whole. But then the realization came. Something so obvious that it knocked the wind from her thoughts. These languages were not meant to be reconciled. Each one was its own cognitive universe. The Krashun depended on breath and pitch. The Zothrel existed only in dream memory. The Kelkari demanded emotional truth. None of them operated from a shared foundation. It was as if 5 solar systems were trying to orbit the same non-existent sun. She looked down at the previous segments she had already translated. They were neat, grammatically precise, but standing side by side, they rejected one another. A sentence composed in Krashun didn't flow into Zothrel. It broke rhythm. Zothrel's dreamy metaphors felt insincere next to Kelkari's unfiltered emotional integrity. Even the transitions between sections felt brittle, like ice pressed against fire. She was building a bridge out of glass across erupting volcanoes. Her mind drifted back to a lecture from Professor Harn, the CMOC linguist, who spoke using a dual spinal modulator. He once said, "Languages are attempts by cultures to explain existence on their terms. True translation is always betrayal." At the time, June thought he was being poetic, but now she saw it for what it was, a warning. These 5 languages didn't want to be translated. They wanted to stay isolated, safe in their cultural bubbles. But if that was true, then this entire exam was a trap, a trial designed not to assess skill but to expose failure. She looked around the room again. Most cadets were struggling, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the exam demanded the impossible. 5 minds pretending to be one. No species could do that, not even her, unless... The solution wasn't translation at all. The idea came like a faint current under her thoughts, subtle but undeniable. What if she didn't try to force these languages into each other's molds? What if she created a new structure, not as a translation of each, but as a mutual grammar, built from the overlapping concepts that every species could understand? At first, she dismissed the thought. It was blasphemy in the Academy. Inventing syntax outside certified structures was viewed as intellectual arrogance. But as she stared again at the jarring transitions between her translated segments, she saw only fracture. What she had built so far was technically acceptable, but fundamentally incoherent. She glanced up. The exam orb continued to pulse cold blue. The countdown hovered silently in the corner of her interface. 2 hours left. It wasn't enough time to learn 5 cultures again. But maybe it was enough to listen to what they all needed and give them something new. June opened a blank slate. The traditional languages would still be required for the final submission, but this would be her private test. She began to write, not in Drenvok, not in Krashun, not in Zothrel or Kelkari, but in a pattern of her own making. She used short declarative roots from Earth's syntax, connected by emotional inflections drawn from Kelkari valence logic. She borrowed harmonic tags from Krashun to signal tense, and directional markers from Drenvok to shape the flow of subject and action. It was clumsy, rough, naive, but it worked. 1 line, then 2. Soon she had a paragraph. Meaning flowed without collision. Emotion transitioned without contradiction. It wasn't translation, it was reformation. And for the first time during this exam, she felt something almost sacrilegious. Relief. June's stylus hovered just above the glowing surface of her console. The moment felt suspended in time, suspended in judgment. She stared at the blank linguistic field, no longer afraid of it, but not yet certain what she was doing. This was no longer translation, this was invention. She had closed the original document. She had set aside the 5 disconnected grammar systems. Now she worked in silence, building from instinct and patterns of meaning she didn't yet have a name for. It wasn't rebellion, it was necessity. No other path had offered coherence, and time was draining from the clock like sand from a broken dome. She began with the pronouns. That had been the first fracture point in all 5 languages. Some species had no personal pronouns at all, while others used dozens to indicate social status, proximity, age, and emotional state. Galactic Neutral used a 3-tiered pronoun set, but it lacked warmth and flexibility. She knew she had to create a root system that was universal and modular. So she chose 3 symbols, simple strokes, 1 horizontal, 1 vertical, and 1 curved. Each could be modified with diacritics that suggested direction of action, emotional involvement, and social context. They didn't represent I or you or he in a traditional sense, but rather the one who speaks, the one who receives, the one who acts on behalf of another. The idea was not to define the individual, but the role in the moment. It was a risk. Most galactic linguists would call it too abstract. But June wasn't trying to impress tradition. She was trying to solve a problem. The syntax had to be readable by someone from Krashun just as easily as someone from Kelkari or Earth. She moved on to verbs. She hated verbs. Every species fought over verbs like empires fought over borders. Some used them as anchors of time. Others didn't use them at all, choosing emotional gradients or symbols of potentiality instead. She decided to approach verbs as changes in state rather than actions. Instead of to give, she wrote, state A becomes state B by external will. Instead of to see, she used state A aligns with presence B. It looked ugly on the screen, cold, clinical, but when she read it aloud, something strange happened. It made sense. It avoided the cultural pitfalls of intention. It didn't assume morality or emotional tone. It described reality without judgment. Her eyes burned. She blinked several times and rubbed her temples. Her thoughts were beginning to blur. She hadn't moved for almost an hour. Her hand ached from holding the stylus at a precise angle. But her new syntax had formed a full sentence now. It said, in her own constructed grammar, this presence, by inner choice, alters the other with calm. Roughly, it meant she gave it willingly and peacefully. The nuance was there, it was readable. She copied the sentence into a separate projection layer and highlighted the key structures. Then came the real test, retranslating it into one of the existing languages. She pulled up the Krishun segment again. It took a moment to reset her thinking into tonal structure, but when she began to vocalize the translated version, it flowed better than anything she had attempted before. The cadences were soft, the transitions intuitive. She played it back on her pitch visualizer. Perfect harmonic intervals, no dissonance, no failure flags. It worked. With renewed energy, she returned to her syntactic framework. She designed prepositions that behaved like orbit markers, always defining the relationship between two entities without assuming hierarchy. She created time markers that weren't based on clocks, but on change thresholds. When something began, when it completed transformation, and when its effects stabilized. It wasn't linear, but it gave context. She used color-coded clusters in her projection to keep track of layers. One hue for grammar roots, another for emotional inflections, a third for subject-object interactions. She also began testing her system by rewriting short excerpts of the Galactic Peace Accord directly into her invented syntax. At first, it was mechanical and slow. Each clause took 3 or 4 reconfigurations before it felt clean. But soon the structure took shape, like a river carving its own bed through resistance. Meaning didn't get lost. If anything, it became sharper. Still, she knew it wouldn't be enough to just make something functional. She needed it to be legible to the Academy's highest evaluators, those who would examine her submission and either pass her or dismiss her entirely for deviating from assigned formats. She had to show that this wasn't an act of creative vanity, but of interspecies necessity. So she returned to the root philosophies of each language. From Drenvok, she adopted their fluid subject chain, an understanding that meaning flowed from movement, not fixed position. From Zothrel, she borrowed the echo structure, repeating certain glyphs to reflect evolving emotional states. From Kalkari, she implemented valence glyphs that changed based on sincerity. From Krishun, she used pitch modulation markers to color a statement's urgency. From Galactic Neutral, she adopted sentence framing with stable initiation and closure markers. Her syntax didn't erase the others, it grew from them. It felt, for the first time in the entire exam, like creation rather than survival. She paused briefly and looked up. Around her, many students were in distress. A Triluvian male had begun pacing within his containment field, muttering slurs against the examiners in his native tongue. One of the Yelloran cadets had collapsed, feathers quivering in fatigue. A few had tried to submit early and were denied by the orb, red lights blinking above their pods. Time remained, but it was no longer an ally. A shadow passed overhead. June looked up and saw one of the senior linguistics instructors floating slowly above the hall in a translucent observation vessel. It was Professor Inereth, a centenarian Jelgar whose evaluations were infamous for being precise to the point of cruelty. He hovered near the middle of the room, watching the projection fields of several cadets. When he passed above June's pod, he slowed. His gaze was unreadable, eyes like obsidian marbles behind translucent skin, but his vessel paused for 3 full seconds. Then it drifted on. June tried not to panic. She knew that any deviation from instructions would draw attention. She told herself it didn't matter. What she was doing wasn't rebellion. It was adaptation, evolution, and perhaps, deep down, a bit of desperation. She leaned back in and worked faster. She converted a full paragraph now. Her syntax used fewer glyphs than expected, but expressed greater density of meaning. She reread the passage 3 times. Each time she felt like the speaker and the listener were on equal ground. No assumptions, no alienation. It was the closest she had ever felt to true translation. Still, doubt crept in. What if no one accepted this? What if her invented grammar was dismissed as gibberish? What if she was disqualified for non-compliance? What if she passed the exam in her own mind, but not in theirs? She clenched her jaw and steadied her hand. She had made her choice when she closed the original documents. She would finish this. She began refining her new system's syntax guide. She added small icons next to each rule, visual cues that could be interpreted without words. She believed that if an idea could not be grasped visually, it wasn't truly universal. She included annotation fields for interspecies logic gaps, giving examples of how different species might interpret the same clause in unique but acceptable ways. Her projection field began to look less like a test submission and more like a prototype for a new linguistic model. She didn't dare think about what it meant. She didn't want to break her own momentum with wonder. There would be time for reflection after the buzzer. And so, with the seconds dripping away and the room filled with breathless tension, June continued to write. Not to translate the past, but to shape the future. Her hand trembled, her mind sharpened, and somewhere deep inside she felt that ancient, quiet confidence that came not from skill or study, but from knowing that what she was building mattered. The final hour arrived with a subtle shift in atmosphere. The blue glow from the overhead orb dimmed slightly, signaling the exam's closing phase. The air inside the auditorium thickened, not in temperature, but in tension. It settled like invisible dust in June's lungs, heavy and dry. She didn't stop to stretch or look around. Her attention remained locked to the syntax field hovering before her. Lines of luminous glyphs flickered in layered arrays across her screen. Her hand moved fast now, no longer uncertain, no longer sketching possibilities. Every stroke had a purpose. She was no longer building, she was applying. She had reconstructed 3 entire paragraphs of the Galactic Peace Accord using her system. Each paragraph was encoded in her custom syntax, followed by back translations into Krashun and Galactic Neutral to demonstrate compatibility. The transitions between clauses were seamless, the tonal inflections converted properly, the emotional valences were recognized by the syntax checker, and most importantly, the translations retained original intent without corrupting the source meaning. It wasn't mimicry, it wasn't interpretation, it was direct equivalence. Across the room, Professor Anarith remained suspended in his observation vessel. Though he no longer hovered above June's station, his occasional pauses above specific pods made it clear that the instructors were watching closely. The red warning lights above other cadets now outnumbered the blue. June didn't need to look to know what had happened. Submissions had been rejected. Syntax engines had failed. Emotional integrity markers had flatlined. For many, the exam was over. For her, the work had only just crystallized into clarity. She copied her 4th paragraph into the base template and activated the autocollect tool. Her syntax required unique formatting. Unlike linear languages, her structure relied on visual nesting, color-coded logic trees, and glyph alignment by relational distance. It was as if she were painting a sentence instead of writing it. The tool accepted the layout without errors. A small green marker blinked. Validation passed. She allowed herself one breath of relief, but the silence broke suddenly. A loud clattering sound echoed through the chamber. A Vortari cadet had stood up too quickly, knocking over her projection stylus and causing her chair's support field to flicker. Her elongated torso rippled with stress vibrations, and she shouted in her native tongue, releasing a sharp chorus of screeches that pierced the ambient hum. The orb above her flashed red. Her submission had failed. For a moment, everyone looked up, even June. The Vortari turned and glared across the room, her gaze pausing on June for a fraction of a second. There was no mistaking the resentment. She had noticed June's progress, perhaps not the content, but certainly the absence of warning lights. Perhaps she saw something in June's posture, or perhaps it was simply the way June's projection glowed differently, no longer matching any known syntax in the room. The Vortari sneered, sat down heavily, and closed her interface. Her defeat was quiet but complete. June looked down again, her pulse slightly elevated. She told herself to ignore it. This wasn't about rivalry. It wasn't about being human. It was about proving an idea. She moved to her final section. The last clause of the peace accord was a ceremonial closing phrase, a poetic passage designed to invoke unity between races without imposing hierarchy. It was notorious among linguists because it contained metaphors from 3 extinct languages, all of which were known to conflict philosophically. Translating it was always more a political gesture than a linguistic one. No cadet had ever submitted a version that passed validation in all 5 languages. June studied the passage in its original cluster. The symbols glowed faintly in ancient ink, preserved from the first galactic accord millennia ago. The words formed images rather than meanings, to bind flame to wind without extinguishing either. The message was clear, yet impossible. Preserve opposing forces in harmony. She considered how her syntax handled metaphor. She hadn't planned a structure for it. Her system wasn't poetic, it was precise. But this sentence required a different kind of clarity. She adjusted her interface and began constructing a layered structure. She defined flame as volatile state with autonomous energy, wind as sustained directional pressure, and binding as mutual presence without priority. She then wrapped the entire sentence in a modal marker, indicating balance rather than resolution. It read, "Two distinct energies maintain mutual presence without diminishing individual function." It wasn't lyrical, but it was accurate, and it would be understandable by any mind trained to read her syntax. She copied the structure into the master submission field and attached the comparative versions. Krishun, Kelkeri, and Drenvach interpretations aligned within acceptable resonance thresholds. The Zothrel reverse logic parser confirmed that the emotional impression matched the dream state logic. She had done it. She didn't move. Her hands trembled slightly, but she let them rest above her lap. Her submission file blinked amber. Ready, but not yet sent. She stared at it for nearly a full minute. Then, slowly, she reached across the interface and pressed her palm to the submit field. The orb above her flashed white. Not blue, not red, white, a signal none of the other cadets had seen. There was a collective intake of breath from those still working. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. One of the instructors seated in the upper gallery leaned forward. Professor Innerith's vessel stopped moving. The white light didn't flash. It glowed. A steady beacon above her pod. A chime rang across the hall. "Submission accepted," the orb announced, in the voice used only for exceptional entries. June swallowed hard. She didn't dare let herself feel anything yet. She had no idea what the white light meant. The rulebook didn't describe it. The syllabus made no mention of a white signal. She sat still, heart pounding, gaze fixed forward. Then something else happened. The white light spread, not across the room, but across the interface above her. Her entire submission was now being projected across the center of the chamber, visible to all. The syntax system she had created, the glyphs, the modifiers, the visual clusters, glowed high above for every student and instructor to see. Murmurs filled the room. Shock, confusion. Some recognized what she had done. Others had no idea what they were looking at. "She made her own grammar," someone whispered. "Is that even allowed? That's not Drenvach? That's not anything." A Triluvian cadet stood up. "She bypassed the test. That's disqualification." Professor Inneroth's voice echoed down calmly from his vessel, amplified not by sound but by neural resonance. "She did not bypass the exam. She completed it using syntactic logic. Her submission passed all language validations." The Triluvian hesitated. "But she didn't use our languages." "She used all of them," the professor replied. "And none. She created a syntax that obeys their rules without copying their forms. That is innovation." Another instructor, seated far to the left, stood and tapped her credentials into the central interface. The orb blinked again. The projection froze. "Cadet June Oswell," the instructor said, her voice sharp, "your syntax is not recognized by the Academy. Do you claim authorship of this structure?" June stood. Her knees trembled slightly, but she locked them in place. "Yes, I do." "Do you submit it as your final linguistic representation of the peace accord?" "Yeah." "Do you understand that by doing so, you accept responsibility for its accuracy and intellectual integrity?" "I do." The instructor nodded. She sat back down. Professor Innerith spoke again. "Then the tribunal will review this submission immediately." And with that, the room dimmed. The projection disappeared. The orb returned to blue. June sat down slowly. Her hands trembled again. The submission was no longer hers. It belonged now to the highest linguistic minds in the Galactic Academy, and all she could do was wait. The tribunal chamber was nothing like the examination hall. It had no rows of desks, no glowing orbs, no cold hum of unspoken panic. It was quiet, absurdly, brutally quiet. June stood alone in the center of a circular platform suspended in a gravity field, with her feet balanced slightly above the polished obsidian floor. Surrounding her on all sides were 12 semi-transmitter projection pedestals, each occupied by a member of the Galactic Linguistic Tribunal. They were not instructors. They were archivists, law lexicographers, neural historians, keepers of the languages that had once divided and now bound the known civilizations together. Above each pedestal, their species emblem glowed faintly. Kelkari spiral, Krishun shard, Simic prism, Terran sigil, and others June didn't even recognize. The woman who had questioned her during the exam now sat behind the central symbol of the tribunal, the ever-turning ring of neutral syntax. She cleared her throat, unnecessary but deliberate, a signal of formality. Cadet June Oswell, your submission during the syntax purity examination was accepted by the system and validated for structural accuracy in all 5 designated languages. However, the method of your submission deviated from all precedent. June nodded once. She didn't speak yet. She knew she hadn't been asked a question. Your syntax, the woman continued, does not belong to any certified interlinguistic family. It is not derived from the standard galactic tree, nor does it replicate known hybrid forms. You created a syntactic structure from elemental grammar markers. Is that correct? Yes, June said. Her voice sounded too loud in the silent dome. I constructed it from shared functional patterns across the assigned languages. I didn't intend to mimic, I intended to unify. One of the tribunal members, a gelatinous sphere that pulsed with language rather than spoke it, emitted a low-frequency harmonic. A translator device whispered aloud in Terran, "Clarify your intention." June's jaw clenched. She felt a prickle of heat rise behind her ears, but she forced herself to keep her tone calm. The original exam languages contradicted each other structurally. I realized that any attempt at perfect translation between them would result in semantic fracture. I didn't bypass the task, I reframed it. I wrote in a syntax that could encode all 5 languages without bias or distortion. My intention was comprehension, not obedience. There was a pause. The woman in the center blinked once. Slow, deliberate. Another tribunal member leaned forward. He was Seamok, crystalline in form, and his voice sounded like broken glass scraping against wind. Did you consult external sources to create this grammar? No, I worked alone. Did anyone assist you? No. The crystal entity flickered briefly, then leaned back. The lead woman tapped her console, and June's entire syntax projection appeared above the platform. 3-dimensional, rotating gently. Diagrams of her glyph system and its modular logic floated in sequence. Root markers, role assignments, valence identifiers, emotional inflections. A holographic sentence lit up and retranslated itself into Kelkari, then Krishun, then galactic neutral. Each version remained structurally sound. No flags, no warnings. The silence in the chamber became stiller, thicker, heavier. June shifted her stance slightly to hide the growing numbness in her legs. Then, finally, the woman spoke again. We have reviewed your system. It satisfies all parameters for semantic stability. Its reverse mapping capacity exceeds expectations. Your logic is modular, reproducible, and adaptable. It has passed compression testing. The tribunal agrees that it functions as a syntactic medium. June exhaled slightly, though she didn't allow relief to take over. However, the woman continued, this tribunal must determine more than technical sufficiency. We are guardians of linguistic legacy. To permit new syntax into the archive is to rewrite how civilization communicates. What you propose is not a clever test answer. It is a foundational mutation. Another voice emerged from the left, this one metallic and echoing. Mutation leads to decay. Mutation ignores tradition. No, June said, her voice firmer now. Mutation leads to adaptation, evolution. This syntax doesn't destroy tradition, it preserves it, without forcing one species' logic onto another. That's the entire point. A murmur passed through the panel. Some tribunal members glowed brighter, others dimmed. You named your system in your submission, the woman said. Do you still wish to use the term lingua primalis? Yes, June said. It means primary language not because it's first, but because it can come before conflict. The chamber fell silent again. The projection field dimmed. The rotating syntax slowed. After a moment, the lead woman stood. This tribunal does not exist to reward cleverness. It exists to preserve balance. What you have created, Cadet Oswald, has the potential to shift that balance. It could unify, it could disrupt, but it cannot be ignored. She lifted one hand and tapped the final symbol on her pedestal. We accept your submission. June didn't move. Her legs nearly gave out. The words had landed, but she hadn't prepared for the weight they carried. The woman continued. Lingua Primalis will be recorded into the Galactic Archive under your authorship. You are hereby certified as an architect of syntax. You are no longer a cadet. You are a contributor to the structure of civilization. A hush fell over the dome. Then the projection shattered like dust and vanished into the air. You may return to your quarters. Your records will be updated within the hour. Further guidance will follow. June bowed slightly because she didn't know what else to do. Her mouth was dry, her limbs buzzed. She didn't remember walking. She only remembered stepping off the platform, then finding herself outside the Tribunal dome, blinking under artificial starlight, surrounded by silence that felt bigger than before. The corridors of the academy no longer looked the same. She passed students who had been in the exam with her. Some avoided her eyes. Some stared openly. One Krishun student murmured a respectful tone and placed his hand over his heart. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind wasn't in her body yet. When she reached her quarters, the door recognized her, but didn't open immediately. A new security protocol had been installed. She waited. A green light blinked. Access granted. Inside, the lights stayed off until she gave the command. She didn't. She liked the dark for once. She sat down in front of her private console. A message was waiting. From Galactic Academy Communications Authority Subject, Authorization Code, Syntactic Integration Schedule Body. Congratulations! Your system will be submitted for pilot integration at 4 diplomatic outposts and 2 trade academies within the next quarter. Prepare for briefing. She stared at the screen. Then she leaned back, let the chairs swallow her, and closed her eyes. She had passed. But it wasn't the exam that stayed in her thoughts. It was the fact that somewhere, on a distant colony world, an alien diplomat might now speak to another through a syntax built by her hand, that 2 species who had never understood each other might now try and might succeed, not because of history, not because of code, but because one girl refused to follow the rules when the rules no longer made sense. She smiled faintly in the dark, and for the first time in her life, June Oswell felt like her voice had a place in the galaxy.